few and far between, and I suspect we'll be seeing much more of that from this weekend onwards. One of the things, however, that Labour have announced is their decision to charge 20% VAT on private school fees and ending business rates relief. Now, the party have backed down on their pledge to strip private schools of their charitable status, which contradicted some comments made by the Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves back in 2021, where she said, "Here's the truth, private schools are not charities, and so we will end that exemption and put that money straight into our state schools. That is what a Labour government will do." Now, the party says it does not actually require the removal of charitable status to achieve its aim. The Institute for Fiscal Studies has estimated that VAT on school fees would raise about 1.5 billion annually, with average fees now about £15,200 a year. But of course, this isn't just about raising money, it's what can be done with it. Labour's plans to inject funding back into the state sector to level up the playing field. In this way, it's somewhat of a redistributive policy. Defending his stance, Sir Keir Starmer has insisted he doesn't want to launch an attack on private schools with his plans and claimed that institutions would not have to pass on the extra cost to parents. Today, we're going to discuss that policy, what it means for Labour, what it means for schools, what it means for parents, and what it means for the economy. Are the numbers raised by the policy significant enough? Should Labour have U-turned on the charitable status element? Should we abolish private schools altogether? Are Labour too anti-aspiration? All these questions and any more that you have, I'm going to hand over to the audience in a bit, but please do think of anything you want to ask our great panel. Now I'm going to introduce the panel one by one, and they'll give some opening remarks. I want you guys to answer the question when you're talking about what do you think of the current Labour Party policy on private schools? And if it's okay, I'll start with you, Faiza.
Yeah, thank you. Just to explain who I am. So I am the Labour Party candidate for Chingford and Woodford Green, fighting Ian Duncan Smith at the next election. It's a very tiny minority vote that he has now, which is just 1,262 votes. It's a really interesting area. I was born there, grew up there. Norman Tebbit was the MP when I was born. And it's a very unequal area on the edge of London. So there's some great state schools, including the ones I went to, but there's also a couple of private schools. And so actually a lot of these arguments come up on the doorstep quite a lot. So I wanted to reflect on that, but let me just start. I'm also, I've worked on inequality issues for a very long time. I teach at London School of Economics. I work with governments around the world on their policies to reduce inequality from Spain to Indonesia. So that's kind of come up with education policy a few times. I've just written a book that came out in June called Know Your Place, How Society Sets Us Up to Fail and What We Can Do About It, all about inequality, social mobility. Of course, there's a whole chapter on education, and private schools are there in that conversation. It's really important to say first off that I support this policy from the Labour Party. There is an inherent tension between saying we want to break the class ceiling and then not doing anything about inequality, not doing anything about private schools and inequality more generally. We know that despite the way that the Tories go on about educational improvements, the difference between outcomes for those that go to state school and private schools has actually grown. And that is perhaps not a surprise when we know how much money, the difference in the money going into private schools or the fees for private schools versus how much per head state school people will get has also grown. And overall wealth inequality and income inequalities have grown in this country as well since 2010. So, we know that there's this hierarchy, we know that there's this gap. We know that we can't do anything about low levels of social mobility. And there was a new study out recently from IFS just showing that in the last 50 years, it hasn't improved. Indeed, there are some signs it's getting worse. So absolutely, if we're going to have this agenda, then we have to do something about private schools, and at least taking away or taxing and doing the VAT tax is a good start and something that we can point to, especially when we make the argument as to where the money will go. So yeah, I support the policy. Saying that, I just do want to reflect on the realities of making these arguments on the ground. I ran in 2019 as well, when people did say exactly that point you just made about anti-aspirational on the doorstep. You know, I send my kids to private school. This is anti-aspirational of Labour. And even this week, I was invited to a book club by some mums, and one woman was like, I agree with your book completely, but also I want my child to be the exception. I want her to escape the challenges that we face. So I would just put all my money into her private education, because it is true that her child will now have these privileges of that private education. And so, you know, how do we make that argument on the doorstep? And just to add, it's not just people that send their kids to private school. It's also in the streets that I grew up, which is on the working class end of the constituency, bordering on Walthamstow. If you go and door knock there, September, October time, the amount of working class parents that say to you, oh, the local school is not great in that bit. I am getting my kid to do the 11+ exam. I really want them to go to private school. And they also see it as like, well, this, you know, maybe my kid could get in. So, you know, why would we want to make it more expensive for others? So, you know, there is a reality of on the doorstep people can push back. Saying that, I have found that people do understand when you talk about the responsibility that any government has to all children. And so I use this example in the book of knocking on someone's door and then being very angry about the fees of their kids' school going up potentially. And she did back down a bit when I spoke about, yeah, but what kind of society do you want your child to grow up in? And making that wider argument as to why any government needs to make sure that all kids, even if they can't afford it, even if their parents can't afford it, deserve a good education to start with. I made a huge effort to go into private schools and talk to people. Understand when you remind them is that it's not just children, it's not just parents of parents that send their kids to private school that are aspirational. My mum called me Faiza Shaheen. Shaheen was my middle name. Faiza means a winner. Shaheen means a bird that flies high. She was obsessed with us doing well. She didn't have any money. My dad was a car mechanic. But she was hugely aspirational for us to do well at school. And every parent has that visceral feeling of wanting their kid to like reach their potential. And sometimes, yeah, people forget that, and you have to remind them that this aspirations are not just something that for parents that can afford to send their kids to private school. I'm just going to end by saying how important it is to, in selling this policy, to not blame the individual, to not blame parents. Because of course, parents want the best for their kids. If they do have the money, it's completely rational given the differences in private and state school outcomes to want to send your kids to private school. But it is important to make this wider societal argument, and just to really emphasize how important it is for us to be pushing on this. This is Labour's policy right now, but not everyone agrees. And people are worried about, how this sounds on the doorstep and losing votes. So it's really important that we have a very tight argument to make that works, that persuades people, and that, you know, delivers.
Is Hans Broekman. As you can hear, I was not born in Liverpool, but I got here as fast as I could. That was in 2008 when my family and I moved to Liverpool, and I became the head of Liverpool College. At that time, an HNC independent school, about average size. and one of the founding members of the HMC. In 2013, a decade ago, we were able to convert that school into a state-funded academy. So I'm really not here with any kind of electoral perspective on the policy. We became a state-funded academy. We grew from about 800 pupils to 1,700 pupils today. We're the most oversubscribed school north of the Watford Gap. In 2019, we were deemed outstanding in all areas. And in our school, all the disadvantaged children, the statistics show that they make more progress than the advantaged children. So when we did this, we did it explicitly because that was the right context for Liverpool. I think the people of Liverpool have embraced something that was quite controversial, although it has been done before in Liverpool. I would say this is the epicenter of these transitions from, in the case of Liverpool College, an institution which had never taken a single pence from the government, had fought extremely hard for that, to a state school. And one of the things that motivated us was the fact that we actually looked at the charitable objects of the founders of the school in 1840, who said that the school should provide to the citizens of Liverpool the education such as they need upon the most moderate terms. And we felt that for the people of Liverpool, that 12 or 13,000 we were charging around that time were not the most moderate terms on which we could offer them an education. So that's the context in which I sort of look upon the particular policy. And a couple of observations there. I'm very for independent schools. I'm very for the independent sector. And I think one of the challenges that I see with the policy, and I think Chris will probably do a better job explaining this. There are about 2,000 independent schools in the country of incredible diversity, of size, even of what they do. And I think, I fear that the policy could make it very, very difficult for some of these small schools. You know, when people think of private schools, they tend to think of Eton. But there's really only one Eton. It would be much more efficient to make a law just forbidding Etonians from being prime ministers. And we would just get it out of our system, because there are lots and lots of other independent schools that do very specific things in music and in other areas. And I think it would be a massive loss to our country if these schools came under more pressure even than they are. I would further say it's the opposite of a leveling up strategy. 20% VAT is not going to affect anybody in London. There is no elasticity to the demand curve for private education in London. These schools are, if you look at the accounts of private schools, and again, Chris can give you much better insight into that. If you look at the accounts, you will see that there's a tremendous disparity within the independent sector between the North and the South. And I fear that, again, an unintended consequence of the policy will be to exacerbate that particular thing. But really, my most fundamental critique is I don't think it's much of a policy at all. You know, all the educational challenges we face have nothing to do with this issue. I mean, part of it is, you know, as a head teacher, you pick the things that are important and you work on those. And I would say this is not important. I think 1.5 billion. When I read what Mr. Starmer wants to do with that money, it's not going to make any difference. The big problems that we face in this, well, let me give you the example of Liverpool. After, you know, 13, maybe 15 years of hardcore reform, less than 50% of boys in Liverpool pass English and math at 4. Okay, that's despite academization, that's despite constant pressure. Like, there cannot be more pressure on schools than there already is through the regulator. Keir says, well, or I should say Mr. Starmer says, I'm not on first name basis at all. He says, well, we're going to take this money and we're going to do more counseling get more mental health people into school. What a strange policy that is. The real issue we've got with our education is that 4 out of 10 children in Britain report being like clinically anxious, right? We have the unhappiest children in Europe. And I don't see any need for a new government to hit some what it conceives of as rich schools. I don't think it will make any difference to inequality in this country. That's all I'm sorry to say. I think it's intended to. I see the intention of the policy, but I think it's insufficiently radical. It is completely divorced in any way from the experience of actually running an inner city comprehensive state school as I do right now, and the challenges that it faces. So I also think it's an opportunity lost, really. I think we're going to spend, this sounds very ironic as I'm here, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about this issue. In fact, we are talking about it, when in fact a new government would do well to talk about some other things, it seems to me. I think just as a matter of justice, it's a correct policy. You know, not that I've ever had to hire a lawyer, but if I did, I would pay 20% VAT to hire that lawyer. And when you send your child to a private or an independent school, I think you're very much hiring a service, and I can see that justice demands. I don't see particularly why you would be exempted from that. Another thing I'm worried about is I think what you could get is, at the moment, there's some leverage on schools, and you know, just to praise Chris and the work that he did. You know, enormous efforts went into reaching out to community, building up bursaries, and making sure that independent schools were working for the common good. And I don't think we can just set that aside. I think once you tax them with this VAT, they will say, fine, you treated us as a business, now we're going to act like a business. And you will lose any and all leverage over these institutions, particularly if you don't take their charitable status away at the same time. So these are just off the cuffs, you know, I'm not a policy geek. I don't know why this was chosen of all the things that a new government could think about in education, why we chose to talk about this. But if we must, then I have concerns about some unintended consequences, which I think I've mentioned. But I think in principle, there is a justice to this idea. I think you can say it is just that this tax be imposed on the school. I just don't think it is, you know, for the children of this country, it does nothing. Absolutely nothing.
Thank you. Jess.
Hi, thank you. My name's Jess Staffenberg. I am a journalist. I used to be an education journalist, now in other things, but I set up a private education policy forum who's hosting you tonight because a couple of reasons. One of them was that my editor at the time, who's actually turned up tonight, used to require me to write a lot of news stories, and it's always good to have a voice on the other side of whatever piece that you're writing up, or on all sides. And there's all sorts of groups out there. There's kind of Comprehensive Future, who will talk to you about the need for comprehensive state schools. There's the sort of group for grammar schools. There's the group for private schools. There's even a group that advocates for academy schools, and they've kind of each got their opposites. And there always just seemed to be this gap of a sensible, some sort of think tank-ish type thing that gave comment and did some data analysis. So I stupidly went to a few people who'd written some books and said, you guys should set this up because nobody reads books and I need someone to quote. And they said, oh, well, why don't you set it up? So I for some reason I did do that. I should not make out like I'm completely private school sector and have had all sorts of experiences. And I went through the private school sector myself, not in primary school, but in secondary school. So the Labour's policy, I agree with a lot of what has been said. I think from the point of view of just facts, what VAT is value-added tax, right? And it's for anything considered a luxury good. I think we only decided in 2021 that sanitary products did not count as a luxury good, despite no woman I know having any choice over whether or not they need them. So we've decided that things that you definitely 100% need don't have VAT above and beyond that, and we consider a luxury, you do pay for VAT. You do have VAT applied on it. So rather than kind of seeing it as this giant class war, it's just, is it a luxury good or not? I'm not the arbiter of whether or not it's a luxury good. You know, I don't know who is. I did have a quick look on YouGov, and on the 4th of September, the last time that the British public, I never know how many people they actually poll because they never poll me, but they came back and found that 52% of whoever gets polled, but we do think this is, you know, the public's opinion, 52% think that it entrenches privilege, having private schools in Britain entrenches privilege, which sounds similar-ish language to me to it being a luxury. So it sounds like if we put it to a vote, most people would consider paying for private school to be a luxury good rather than a necessity, in which case I just think it's perfectly acceptable for a government to say that VAT should be applied. I'm very happy to be debated on that. I think that I completely agree with Hans that the £2,400, whatever it is, Golden Hello, which I don't know if you all know, but that is what Keir Starmer said he's going to do with the money. And again, cleverer people than me to decide if that's the best way to spend money. Instinctively, from like 6 years of interviewing head teachers, I would say it's not the right thing to do with £2,400, to do with that £1.7 billion. I mean, I'm sure a lot of teachers, you know, we say it won't make any difference for children. Actually, the people who teach children in this country are teachers, and they are on their knees in lots of cases. I'm sure a lot of them would really appreciate £2,400. So we shouldn't make out like it doesn't make any difference at all. However, whether it would keep any of them in any longer, I really doubt. And that's to do with things that aren't to do with private schools, like workload, yada, yada, yada. On the other hand, the UK is a real outlier in how obsessed we all are with private schools. I mean, it's very tiring for the Independent Schools Council about how much they end up in the headlines. And it's because the country is obsessed. My father's German finds it all quite bewildering. What he also finds bewildering, though, is that we have the system in the first place, because you don't start fretting when your child is 5 years old in most other European countries about where you're going to send your child, because there is such a strong offer from the state system. Not always, but the way that our system is quite divided, where private schools is seen as the elite option in this country, is not replicated a lot across the European nations. You could argue, although there's no research to back this up that I have, only sort of books like that obviously take a particular angle, like Little Sad Men, if any of you have read that, by Richard Beard. But he talks in there about interviewing an education minister, granted, I think a few decades ago, who said, you know, my job is to ensure nothing happens to private schools and that state schools don't get enough funding. I mean, it's a really dramatic quote, and that's clearly not the goal of every government that comes through of whatever stripe. I do think, though, it would be interesting to find out what might happen to decisions to do with state school funding if ministers didn't send their children to private schools, had never gone through private schools. We've only ever had a handful of secretaries of education who didn't go to private school themselves. You can't answer that question. You don't know whether we would get more funding into the state sector if there wasn't a private school sector. So my argument is VAT should be applied because it is a luxury good, I think, according to our definitions. I don't think the golden shake bonus is what you should do with it. And people cleverer than me need to work out what to do with that money. And I think that, you know, there's just an argument around the way that we underfund state schools and the reasons for that. And you absolutely can't pin that on private schools. That would be ridiculous. I also think the way that Britain is so divided between the two systems shouldn't be entirely unconsidered when wondering why we have underfunded them for so long. So that's my view on that. But it's not a PEP's view. That's just some reflections from myself. Thank you.
Thank you. And then I will pass over to Chris.
You can.
I'm using this microphone under sufferance. I hate them. I suppose I should say a little about myself. I came into teaching when I was 40, and after a few years, I became the head of a school, large boys' school in Manchester, Manchester Grammar School. An interesting place, and I think in some respects, Hans has paid huge tribute to it. It has not the biggest, but one of the biggest means-tested bursary schemes in the country. I know that when I was involved with the Headmasters and Headmistresses Conference 10, 12, 14 years ago, there was a constant barrage, first from the Charity Commission, Dame Susie Leather, saying that in order to have charitable status, you had to provide lots of means-tested bursaries. And then we had a barrage of a different kind saying that unless you supported academies and free schools, you couldn't really count yourself as a proper independent school with a moral and social conscience. It was interesting, Manchester Grammar School actually did support the creation of a free school in part of Manchester called New Islington, which is a fairly rundown area. We did it in partnership, interestingly, with a property developer called Urban Splash, but also Manchester City Council, which, as I'm sure you're aware, is about as Labour as they get. Not so Labour that when they have new housing developments, they always insist on social housing, because they don't. Back to the New Islington School, as it's called, a free school. An interesting innovation. I did ask the deputy leader of Manchester Council why they were bothering supporting us in this endeavour, because of course it didn't seem to be in tune with the way that Manchester wanted to run its educational scene. And he said that sooner or later it will be ours. And we are very patient here in Manchester. I suppose Hans has said so much that I could and would have said that this looks like a distractor to me. Relying on what I would call the fallacy of generalization. When you look at the press, with one or two notable examples, exceptions, independent schools, Eton, Harrow, Westminster, St. Paul's, Winchester. That's the message you get. I would commend to you the annual census of the Independent Schools Council. Now, they only cover 1,400 of the 2,400 odd independent schools in this country. But even with those schools that get membership of the Independent Schools Council, the ISC as it's called, and there are hurdles they have to jump over. There's a huge range, diversity. Over 800 of those schools have less than 350 pupils. The primary schools in that sector have an average of 235 schools. Now, there's something very interesting, and one piece of data which is really pertinent to this debate is that new entrants to the independent sector, 30% of them come from the state sector. Since I retired from headship, I potter about schools up and down the country, advising heads and others on safeguarding and child protection. And I interview a lot of students. And I ask the questions you've got to ask about whether they're being bullied, whether they're being harassed. And what's fascinating, troubling, disturbing is that the response is so often, no, I'm not being bullied, I'm not being harassed, but I was in my previous school, which was a state school. It does worry me that I get that answer so often. That's not to say that there isn't bullying and harassment in many independent schools, because there is. There is. I see that on a regular basis. We've all got a hill, a mountain perhaps, to climb. anybody can do what I did. 4 schools across the country. One of them is rated inadequate by Ofsted, as bad as it gets. Why? Because they've had changes of leadership in the heads and deputy heads and governing body. So they haven't managed the school well. So no matter how good a job the teachers are doing, they are inadequate. One of them actually has on its website the notice that says, make sure fascinating. Let me just pick up this piece of paper that's gone walkabout. Here we are. Maximum. They actually have a sliding scale depending on your age and the number of pupils in the school. 158 pupils in that school. Hollygurt School in Nottingham, fee 15,000 with 187 in the school. Crystal Gardens School in Bradford, fee 1,750. Number in the school 134. A year, 1,750. You can work out the 20% on that quite easily. The majority of the parents who send their children to that school are taxi drivers. Charlton House School in Southampton, fee 8,328. Number in school 13. Sorry, yes, 33. That's the school that's rated inadequate. And it doesn't talk about hellfire in its website. The school that does is rated outstanding. We have a lot of problems, and Hans has alluded to these in the educational system. Huge numbers, whether you're in the independent or the state sector. And of course, there are many schools that are hybrid. They've got a foot in both camps. Ballet schools, music schools. It's not as simple as some people try to make out. But there's another problem that those who are engaged with getting us to focus on VAT because it stops us thinking about other things want us not to think about. A quarter of all 11 to 16-year-olds in this country have private tutors at some time during their senior education. A quarter. In some parts of the country, it goes up to 40%. Now, of course, what's going to happen if you put VAT on schools? And Hans is absolutely right. It won't make a ha'porth of difference to schools in the southeast. But I've just read out a number of schools, and at least 3, if not all 4, would be in difficulties. Institute for Fiscal Studies, actually, I like it when economists, that rare occasion when they're actually honest. And the senior research fellow for the Institute of Fiscal Studies, when faced with the problem of, will there be an exodus from schools if we put VAT on, says, I don't know. I don't know. And what we've got here is a policy based on a prejudice. But some people say it's a healthy prejudice. But let me go back to the young people that I talk to. The waifs and strays who see the independent sector as a safe haven, because they do. These are not the Etons and the Harrows and the Winchesters and the St. Paul's. These are the smaller schools quite often, where parents and others group together to pay the fees. at Manchester Grammar School, we knew that a very large number of our pupils were there, not because their parents were paying the fees, but because extended families were paying the fees. Because we had 300 means-tested bursaries. I do wish, by the way, the independent sector would stop boasting about the amount of money that it gives to children to help support and bring down the fee level, when the vast majority of those pupils are receiving it not as means tested, but as enticement. That's schools council speak. Look at your own statistics, because I got that from your own book, matey. Right. To conclude, really, I suppose I feel pessimistic because we've got an insane government that thinks that the best thing to do now is make everybody above the age of 16 do maths and English. Students tell me that they can't wait to give it up. On the other hand, we've got a government in waiting, and yes, I think they will be elected, but I'm not sure if the MPs for Keighley and the would-be MPs for Keighley and Bradford will get in, because there's going to be a tidal wave against them of aspirational families in those areas. I would like them to start talking about education as a whole. I once made the mistake, and I will finish with this, of writing a letter to The Guardian about, can we not have a decent debate about selection? And the retort from several of the respondents was that we don't need to listen to this elitist idiot, that's me, who knows nothing about the realities of life. I suppose, like you, I was brought up in more difficult circumstances.
Thank you. Okay, so I would like to see how many people have questions in the audience, because we have about half an hour left, and I don't want to take it up with too much of me if other people have things to ask. So can you put your hand up if you have a question? In that case, I might go straight to the audience then. Do we have a mic, or do people need to shout? Brilliant. So we'll do it one at a time, if that's okay. We'll start with the lady in the red. Lady in red. If you are directing your question at a specific panelist, could you say that? But if it's to the whole panel, that's fine.
Sure.
Thank you.
My name is Laura McInerney. I am the co-founder of something called TeachTap, and I'll just give you some evidence about what you've talked about, which is how popular some of these policies actually are. So we survey about 10,500 teachers every day. Recently, we did a comparative judgment exercise where we took the 15 policies in the Labour mission document, got them to compare, so they had to pick between two different policies, and then we were able to rank them. Now, what was interesting is that the ending VAT and rates exemptions came 7th out of the 15, so you can read that either way, thankfully. What was really interesting, though, that the least popular was those extra payments to the new teachers after 2 years service. So the thing that they want to do with this is not popular. However, and this is where the key question comes in, it is the only policy out of the 15 which actually raises money. And there are some more popular policies which could be entirely covered even by the amount that would be raised in the very negative kind of reviews of this. So people like EDSK, who are pretty pessimistic overall that this would work and would only bring in a few hundred million. So for example, breakfast clubs in every primary school, that's 5th. It's only behind policies on mental health and Ofsted. Even at its punchiest estimates, that would cost £400 million per year. So my question is, if they're not raising the money from doing this, where else would those of you who feel this is an inappropriate tax, where else would you get that money from to cover those breakfast clubs?
Hans, shall we start with you?
I'm only a head teacher in Liverpool. I mean, well, I think it would be better just to, raise tax. I mean, this is a tax. It's intended as a tax on the wealthy. So think of some other way to tax all wealthy people. Because I think, some of these institutions that Chris mentions, I actually know, and they are going to be collateral damage in this. You surveyed the popularity of the policy with teachers? Is that what?
And yeah, it was all teachers. It's about 10,000. We do it nationally representative, and it does include private school teachers. Among them, obviously, much less popular.
Yeah. Well, we don't survey kids and parents. It would be interesting to hear what they would think. But I'm afraid I'm really the wrong person I'm going to be very I'm sure this is all on the record. I don't think that the problems that we have in schools are related to money. Okay? Money is always a problem, but our most profound problems would not cost money to solve. So you're talking to the wrong guy. I'm not licking my lips saying, oh, if only we had golden welcomes, and if only we had breakfast club, and if we only had this, and we only had that. You could not, even in a world where even in the world where the funding in state schools matched the independent school average funding, I think there would still be very, very serious problems in schools in this country. So I'm the wrong, I don't need money to fix what I want to fix.
Is it all right if I just
I was going to say, do you want to come in next? And because obviously you've worked on this policy area for a long time, and do you want to maybe comment on the idea that some of the problems in the education sector aren't just to do with funding?
I don't work in the education sector, so I'm not best placed to ask. But what I would ask if I was a journalist speaking to Hans is what percentage of your pupils are free school meals and SEND?
We have, at Liverpool College, we have 1,700 pupils. We have 30 children who are looked after, 90 educational healthcare plans, 22% are on free school meals, which is just below the average. So in a decade, this has become exactly the profile. In fact, slightly more EHCPs, slightly more children who are looked after than schools of comparable size. So I think we're not talking about something that not every school faces in similar proportion.
Just wanted to ask. I guess I'll leave it up to teachers to discuss whether or not they feel like more money would make a difference to the system. There's obviously schools with like 48% free school meal kids. They do get more money when they have more free school meal kids, but a lot of them I used to interview would be like, we literally can't hire an education psychologist and I need one. So, but that's a debate within the sector, not for me. I think the only other thing is if earlier, Hans, you said that it's just on the basis of how we define value-added tax, it's just for value-added tax to be applied. I mean, with all policies, there's collateral damage. Probably no policy would have ever been passed by any government ever, right? So how do you say that it's just to do it, but because of collateral damage, in some cases, we shouldn't do it?
No. I want to be very clear. I'm not against putting what. For example, what bothers me is that there will be schools like Liverpool College when this VAT policy. Now, there used to be a pathway for a school like that to become a state school, particularly if it was deemed to have assets or expertise that was useful to the state sector. That has been ideologically smudged to death by both parties and cannot be done. Now, I think it is irresponsible to impose the policy without thinking about what will happen there, because a lot of these assets, and Chris has mentioned some of the specialisms, the hybrid schools, you have to think about these things. And I see no evidence that has been thought about at all.
I totally
so
agree.
It's a sort of 90 days, we can pass this law, we can get it started, and then we'll figure that out. The real opportunity, look, from all the way back to 1900, even Churchill believed that there shouldn't be private schools anymore. We've gone through Blair taking away the assisted places scheme, Adonis opening up the possibility for schools to become, this country is obsessed with this question and never, ever actually sets a long-term course. And in the long run, what do we want? We want great schools for everybody. I think we want diversity in provision. The Tescoification of this system has got to end. All these children are in the same school, being taught more or less the same way in the same places. There is not the diversity that we should be striving after in these policies. So there's an opportunity here to think, what do we want to do with all these places if this does? In fact, do we want to make bold offers to some of these institutions and get them to jump now as a deliberate policy? That is totally absent from the discussion. I think the Conservatives, and I did actually, I mean, you know, you don't like to, watching Andrew Adonis and Michael Gove talk to each other about Liverpool College, I realized whatever I felt about them personally and politically, they were interested in reform. They were willing to think big. They had ideas about what could really be done. The absence of ambition is very, very striking. We're just going to take this money and pump it into the same thing and hope it becomes better. You know, folks, that, I don't know. Where I come from, we call that stupid.
I really like that. But to be clear, you are saying that the money should be raised because you do agree with VAT. So I think Hans would be paying for the thing that Laura's talking about.
Yeah, no, a few things. It's not, I don't think that this is a substitute for broader vision. I absolutely am not going to argue that like this is somehow going to solve everything. Of course not. Is this working?
What is the broader?
I'm not, that's above my pay grade. So, you know, and so absolutely, you know, what is that broader vision for the education sector? What's the best use of that money according to teachers? And like listening, my husband works in the state education sector. He's a special needs teacher. Let's listen to what would make the real difference there. Absolutely, money is an issue. It's not the only issue, but it is an issue. I go to all my local schools and it comes up continuously, especially around special needs, education.
And further education colleges.
Yeah, which is
where
I studied. Absolutely. So, you know, to act as if money isn't the issue, I just think a lot of people would, or a big issue, a lot of people wouldn't see that. I think, you know, we're kind of getting into the nitty gritty of some specific private schools here and there that do something on X in the same way that we, you know, I understand, like, you know, we always point to the Eatons, etc. Then the history of this country is such that private schools have been very key to a class hierarchy. That's just true. And even since 2010, you know, you pointed out a few schools which sound like they don't have very high fees, but overall, the average gap has opened up. And again, I don't want to say that like all of our problems are down to private schools. They are not. I'm an economist. I work on inequality. You look at the increases in wealth, you look in the increases in income inequalities. There are broader societal issues that education reflects. And too often we expect our teachers to sort out all of those broader issues in the economy. And it's too much to ask. We ask our state school teachers to get our kids to jump higher and higher hurdles in order to, you know, this very narrow sense of making it to go to Oxford or Cambridge. And that absolutely is not okay. We do need a broader image, a broader vision, a broader idea of what we do. Saying that, to just leave private schools as they are, not, you know, even just something as simple as a VAT, like even you admit it's just a matter of kind of justice. And, you know, it's a good that, you know, really, when you look at the facts, should be taxed. That is just one small thing. And, you know, it was interesting to hear that question on where the money comes from, which often happens. You said, oh, tax the wealthy more. You think the resistance from private schools as this conversation goes is bad? Try and increase wealth taxes and hear and see the number of panels you'll get, the number of you know, this is the prophecy of inequality, that when you have elite interests, they will block change. And so, you know, there's some way in which a government or an opposition party has to set forward a bigger agenda to redistribute in these levels of inequality that we have, given the state that severe issues we have of our public underspending. And so, you know, you can say, oh, don't do private schools, do wealth, or do tax the rich more. That's kind of what's happening. That's kind of what this is about, in a sense. And it's an element of that, and it's a very small thing. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting to me that it creates so much upset.
Chris, do you have anything to add? And then we'll take another question.
I'd rather that people be entirely honest and say, we don't like the independent sector, we don't like private schools, we don't like fee-paying schools. Let's now have a strategy to get rid of them altogether, rather than like a sniper going for one thing. I think this country is in need of a total overhaul of its educational system. Putting a few quid, if we don't have a mass exodus from independent schools, if the VAT ends up in the Chancellor's pocket, then is that going to persuade new teachers to come in? The independent at the Institute of Physics says unlikely for people that have done physics at university, because they say the main obstacle for that group, and it's one of the biggest shortage areas, is that when they go into state schools, they're asked to teach chemistry and biology as well as physics. They don't want to teach chemistry and biology. They just want to teach physics. So they then go and get their jobs in the city and elsewhere instead. They're not particularly interested in money. I don't think the extra golden hello is going to help. But what I hear, I mean, I don't actually think that paying fees to go to school is a right thing, but I just think the whole educational system is in such a mess, it needs more than this little sniping, hectoring approach. At the moment, I don't know which is worse, Conservatives or Labour. I think they're all barking mad.
Okay, we'll take another question. Who had their hands up? Give it to this gentleman at the front in the dark grey jacket. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks. Yeah, I'm thinking about unintended consequences. I represent, pretty closer. Is that better? Yeah. I'm thinking about unintended consequences. My name is Ewan Japes from English UK, who represents English language schools. We bring in 600,000 students to the UK every year, worth 1.5 billion, employs about 35,000 people. Now, initially, when VAT was abolished for private schools, we still continue to pay VAT. So students coming here still continue to pay VAT. We did a legal challenge on that in 1993 and got the industry VAT exempt, which it has been for the last 30 years. Situation we find ourselves in, 20% of our schools closed forever during the COVID period. We got no relief or help from government, despite lobbying. And obviously students have a big choice about where they go. UK is the most expensive place at the moment for students to go. They can study their English lessons cheaper in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, USA quite often. So do we want to be charging them as well? Do we want to be charging judo lessons, music lessons? I mean, this would be the unintended consequence. And my concern would be that if the government imposes VAT on, say, public schools, private schools, where does this stop? It's easier to say, well, all private education, all privately paid education needs to be VATable, because otherwise you'll be open to legal challenges, just as we won our legal challenge 30 years ago. So I just wanted to reflect on that and where this stops.
Jess, do you want to start on that one?
It's a really good question. It's a really good question that I don't know the answer to. Where does it stop? You've got private tutors. We've obviously got higher education, which isn't quite the same. I think I would go back to that. It's kind of most people understand it as a customer interaction on a not essential good. I do not understand the ins and outs of where you do and don't apply VAT. The only other one I remember reading about was about, I think it was biscuits and cakes a while back, wasn't it? And sanitary products. Does anybody have conclusive answer on whether all private tutors have VAT on their fees? It depends probably on the size of the business that they run, I would say. Yeah. Yeah. It's what, sorry? Yeah. So self-employment income, yeah. One of my friends is, and you have to hit over a certain amount. £88,000 a year. So I think there is some of the answer, but I really don't have the details. And I'd agree with Hans that like a long-term approach to the whole policy would be needed, and to mitigate things like you're talking about and try to support and help as much as possible.
Does any other panel member want to give a brief answer on this point particularly? Because I'm keen to get the other two questions in. Anyone want to add anything? No? Okay, can we get the mic to the other two, and we'll take them at the same time, if that's okay? It was you, wasn't it? And then the lady behind in the black top.
Thanks very much. My name is Pete Foster. I'm the public policy editor at the FT. I think on the private tutoring, truthfully, most of the, speaking as someone who's used private tutors to try and get a useless child through his physics GCSE, they're mostly, in my experience, brokered through websites, and they're often graduates making a few quid on the side. I imagine a lot aren't making the 88,000, and therefore be quite hard to catch them in sort of grey economy there. My question was, obviously 1.5 billion is that sort of 2% of the current budget. It's not a life-changing sum of money, but it's still a reasonable sum of money. My question is, where would you spend it? And it was just picked up actually on there as the question about, you mentioned that 50% of boys are not getting level 4, and T levels was a really in Liverpool, to be clear, level 4 in maths and English. And obviously there's been a debate around T levels, which I suspect the Labour Party may or may not be about to can anyway. But there's a whole question about routes for, people who are doing BTECs. And you mentioned FE colleges that are chronically underinvested. Salaries are 30% below secondary school levels. Even with the 900 million the government promised, there's still, I think the IFS says, 20% below 2010 levels. I mean, would that be a good use of the money, specifically using the 1.5 billion to assist and create better routes